Everyone, welcome back to the Peace and Liberty Podcast. Happy to be joined again by my good friend Jose Nuno, who you may remember from episode 74, which I'll link to. And you also may remember that he's a writer for Mises.org, that he puts out an extensive amount of information mostly related to Venezuela, but he's also really, really good on guns. In fact, he just put out a new ebook titled The 10 Myths of Gun Control, Debunking the Fake News Media's Lies About Guns, and you can see some copies right behind me. So you're going to be able to find that at gumroad.com. And I'll link to it down below. It is case sensitive, but the link will also be in the show notes page. So for a few bucks, you can support people who are fighting the good fight. We need more of those people. Now, one last thing I'll add before I begin is that I'm still not on Patreon, but I'm also not sure what progress has been made with Jordan Peterson and David Rubin's news website. They're trying to do some alternative to Patreon. And the only thing I'm willing to accept right now is you can donate some books to me. I'm going to put up my Amazon wish list. It's going to be at forpeaceandliberty.com/donate. And of course, my website is forpeaceandliberty.com, which will be updated at some point. Jose, glad to have you back on.
Thank you so much, Steven.
Yeah, just real quick, I want to touch on Venezuela because we talked about it, I think it was 4 months ago. And from what I can tell, it's gotten worse in some ways. It's gotten better, potentially better in some ways. But I'm still reading crazy articles showing purses made out of bolivars because that's how worthless the money is. I saw another picture that just shows the edge of the sidewalk leading to the gutter. You know, if you have money in the gutter because it's so worthless. I'm curious if you could just briefly tell us if you know anything about the current situation there, because the news is just sanctions. That's the whole problem. And, you know, we discussed it from a little bit of a different viewpoint last time.
Well, I'll be honest, I haven't been following Venezuela as much as lately because I've been shifting my focus towards more domestic issues like the gun stuff. And I actually will let your audience know that I do have a Venezuela ebook that should be coming out in the next few months, so stay posted on that. I'll touch on that more later. But the situation there, it is like deteriorating, and the U.S. is saber rattling with sanctions and other interventionist stuff, and I believe that intervention is absolutely harmful in this case and will create a bunch of negative unintended consequences, like a refugee crisis, among others. And in this upcoming project, I will make the case against U.S. intervention as well in Venezuela. But yeah, I think Venezuela versus like socialist failure, and it will continue to like deteriorate. And I think that the more the U.S. saber rattles, the stronger the Venezuelan government will be, and it also will become more tyrannical, because in these situations when there's actual like threats of sanctions or stringent sanctions put in place, they tend to make the governments in question much more stronger and much more tyrannical, because they can have now a scapegoat in saying that the U.S. is the one responsible for this, blah, blah, blah. Provides good cover for them.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's a little bit complicated right now because obviously they want to take any news they can get and make it sound as if, oh, it's just U.S. intervention is causing their problems. Well, no, it's probably like a nail in the coffin, but we'll get to that in another episode. I'm glad to hear you have another book coming out on that. But let's jump right into your book. I just got finished reading it, and it is powerful. Given its brevity, it is powerful. So let me just jump to the first myth here. And I'll try not to give away too much in your book because I want people to go out and buy it just for a few bucks. You know, you're really supporting things that Jose does. And obviously he's got more coming out. So we owe this guy a few bucks. For the guy a few smackers, as Tom would put it. So myth number one is going to be that laxer gun laws would lead to Wild West scenarios. So is there anything to this, or have people maybe watched a little bit too much John Wayne?
Well, yeah, this is a common fallacy we hear all the time among gun control advocates, that if you liberalize gun laws, you'll have like Wild West shootouts and vigilante justice out on the streets. For a start, as a history major, when I hear about the so-called Wild West, it gives me kind of like an aneurysm, if you will, because it's actually not the case. The Wild West was much safer than most people realize. Yes, it was no paradise. Homicide rates were pretty high at that time, but they were mostly among willing combatants in duel-like situations in a lot of Western towns. there's a ton of literature that covers it, that in a lot of Western towns, there were actually not many bank robberies like the Hollywood videos would like you to believe. In fact, a lot of sex crime like sexual assault and rape were non-existent. So that myth needs to be discarded. And as far as goes in the United States, we've seen since the 1990s not only the ownership per capita of guns increase, but also the amount of reforms for concealed carry and constitutional carry has allowed up to nearly 20 million people be licensed concealed carriers, and there's now 16 states with constitutional permitless carry. And in this time frame, crimes continue to drop despite all the hand-wringing you hear from gun control advocates and all the fear-mongering of how having more guns on the street and having more individuals carrying will just lead to unwanted bloodshed and chaos. It's not the case. It's just another case of showing that when people actually have freedom, they tend to be pretty responsible and they exercise it accordingly.
Very well said. Very well said. Well, myth number 2 and 3, I think, really tie together because you talk about a few of the same countries here. And those myths are that number 2 is that gun registration does not lead to gun confiscation. They'll argue that, oh, we're not here to take the guns. We just want to get rid of the ones that are used in mass shootings. And that also really ties in with the idea that myth number 3, that foreign gun control works. So I guess you'll talk about Australia for a minute, South Africa, and of course, what's happening right here in the USA.
Well, yeah, gun registration historically has been used by a lot of very tyrannical regimes. And in fact, gun registration has been implemented by like normal governments, but then has been used by subsequent authoritarian regimes. For example, the case of Nazi Germany. A lot of gun advocates make the mistake of saying that the Nazis passed gun registration. It's actually false. It was the preceding Weimar government, the Weimar Republic, passed gun registration to keep Nazis and communists from coming to blows on the streets.
I think you're referring to the book Gun. Sorry. I was just saying. I think you're referring to the book Gun Control in the Third Reich by Stephen Halbrook. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yes.
That book's a monster book. I'm definitely going to link to that because that book is like, I'm sure if you've read it, it's like a footnote at every sentence. But go ahead. You're absolutely right.
Well, they used that gun control that was established beforehand to tyrannize the Jewish population and subject them to the most one of the most heinous forms of genocide we've seen in human history. And then in the Cuban case, you have I wrote about this in Mises in one article that I'll send you in a link. But the preceding Fulgencio Batista, the dictator that came before Fidel Castro, he implemented some gun registration of sorts that Castro would use to basically consolidate his power and tyrannize the Cuban population and turn it into like the closest and most neighborly example of communism that you will find. It's like not literally 90 miles away from the United States. And also, let's fast forward to Venezuela, present-day Venezuela. Venezuela has never had strong gun rights in its history. It's never had a tradition of it. And its first form of gun control was passed in the 1930s. And it's featured registries for decades. And then when Hugo Chavez came into power, he took advantage of those registries and built on top of that gun control and has facilitated numerous forms of gun confiscation and gun buybacks to consolidate his power and also just make sure the Venezuelan populace is disarmed and unable to overthrow his government.
Yeah, well said. I don't even think you mentioned those countries in the book, but yeah, I mean, there's so many different cases where gun confiscation, it's absolutely necessary for them to deprive people of the right to defend themselves. And then what can they really do? I mean, they have to succumb to whatever the government wants them to do. Yeah, those two bits are squashed. Let's move on to, let's see what I got here. Well, myth number 4 is really interesting because I'm sure you know Maj Toure from Black Guns Matter, and a point he often makes is that gun control is racist. Now, I did not know this until someone mentioned it to me, but did you know that the first gun laws in the U.S. were passed right after slavery ended in the late 1800s? They were part of the Black Codes, if I remember, and they were to prevent newly freed slaves from owning weapons. So I actually haven't read word for word what you wrote in here. I'm still absorbing it. It's great, but I'm sure you touched on that. And yeah, just tell us about how is gun control actually racist?
Well, actually, the first gun control laws against blacks date even to the foundation of this country. If you look at the history of like the American South, a lot of these newly formed states were very wary of what was going on in Haiti, where a black population rose up against their slaveholding masters and overthrew them. So a lot of states in the South, even before the Reconstruction era, had forms of gun control. And I believe, the Nat Turner Rebellion of the 1830s made a lot of states double down too, because they were very scared that a potential black uprising was imminent. But the most comprehensive forms of gun control that were passed were indeed the Black Codes, which targeted a lot of the newly freed men and made sure to like keep them from owning guns. And as a result, they were persecuted through Jim Crow laws, lynch mobs, and other white supremacist groups at the time. Now, one unheralded form of gun control affecting certain races was as well the Japanese internment experience of the 1940s, because a lot of people don't forget that FDR, in his Executive Order 9066, he targeted Japanese Americans, Italians, and Germans that were suspected of it, but it was mostly targeted and directed towards the Japanese Americans. And in this process, to facilitate it, Japanese Americans were told to turn in their firearms. Their firearms were confiscated, and that is something that is not really touched upon in your history books. And to this very day, you see in urban areas that gun control laws disproportionately hurt minorities because of the fact that minorities find themselves in big cities that pretty much are all anti-gun. The only major urban centers that you will find in relatively pro-gun states these days are like Atlanta and like Houston and Dallas, but the rest, it's draconian gun control no matter how you slice it. And you have like universal background checks and all these forms of hoops you have to go that price out a lot of poor people and a lot of minorities. And I think like this is not in my book, but the LA riots of the 1990s, you saw that that the Korean store owners defending their property with their firearms. There's strong firearm ownership culture across minority communities. And what Black Guns Matter is doing is absolutely phenomenal, because they're opening up the discussion in places where, frankly, a lot of pro-gun organizations have had a lot of trouble in reaching out to. And it's important that we connect with everyone from the suburbs, urban centers, rural areas, you name it.
Absolutely. I'm actually happy to be corrected on that point. I guess I just didn't go far back enough because, you ask most people when were the first gun laws implemented, they say, sometime in the 1900s. I had read one paper that talked about how they argued the first were after slavery ended. but you're arguing that's even farther back than that. I'm wondering, maybe you can link me to something later that I can read about that, because I guess you're a history buff and I'm getting there, so that's awesome. And yeah, related to Maj Toure, quick announcement.
Yeah, it's in the book as well. But yeah, there's actually a really I forget the name of it, but there is a very good book as well, written in the 90s by one Second Amendment writer. Lost the name of the book, but it's really good. It talks about the history of gun control from the colonial era to the present. And there's also the 400 Years of Gun Control by Howard Nemerov. That book is really good.
I'm going to link to both those books. I think the John Lott book you're talking about, is it More Guns or Less Crime, or would it have been a different book?
John Lott's More Guns, Less Crime. Oh, I actually found the book that I was talking about. It's called The Racist Roots of Gun Control by Clayton E. Kramer. I'll
love it. I've been looking for a book just like that. Well, it's awesome. Well, let me make a quick announcement here, because most people don't know I work heavily with the Mises Caucus. And Maj Toure, I think he's going to run for, I forget all these positions. I think it's like city mayor or something like that. He's going to run in Pennsylvania. And, my good friend Michael Heiss, one thing that Maj has told him is, look, when you're speaking to the Black community as a white guy, they're just not going to hear you at first. But, Maj's point of view is that, let me get up there and talk to them first. Let me introduce you, Michael Heiss, and then you get up there and do it. And then you'll have a better chance they'll trust you. It is true that we have cultural differences in the U.S., and it's hard to reach certain groups of people, especially when, we're arguing that they're victimized. So that's just one quick announcement. People should definitely go out and support Maj. He's a new libertarian in that sense. I mean, I think he's obviously had libertarian roots throughout his life, but he's really a good guy. I love that guy. So let's see here. I want to go ahead and skip ahead, because we're going to run out of time eventually. So I'm going to skip ahead. I want to spark enough curiosity here so people actually go buy the ebook, because not everything should be given away for free. But this next one is myth number 7, and it argues that background checks will reduce crimes. Now, to be fair, like I said, I'm still absorbing the book, but did you mention the loophole at gun shows talking point? Because that's a huge one. And what else you got? What's a good argument against all this?
Well, both regular and universal background checks don't work. And I attack everyone from typical moderate pro-gun lobbies to the left in this section. Well, first off, we have to understand the regular background check system, NICS, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. It was actually established in the 90s. It's not even an form of regulation. It's relatively new, and a lot of people treat it like it's some baseline of sorts that's existed for a long time, but it hasn't. And even prior to its implementation, whenever a lot of states were loosening up their gun laws, crimes continued to drop. So it's fallacious to suggest that this is like a necessary instrument for fighting crime. And it really just adds one layer of bureaucracy to the sale of guns, which in turn is passed on to consumers. But one of the more insidious facts about the NICS system is its ability to generate false positives. False positives refer to cases where an individual who has a first and last name that is similar to a criminal or whatnot is mixed and matched with that criminal, and in turn they are stripped of their gun rights because of that data confusion. It's actually pretty big, and there are a lot of cases that are nearly in the 6 figures that result in that. And Congressman Thomas Massie points out that a lot of these false positives disproportionately hurt minorities, especially African Americans, who tend to share names with other criminals. It's just one more reason why I think the entire system, even like obviously the universal background check system is terrible, but the normal background check system should be completely scrapped. Like any type of regulation from the federal level is an infringement on the Second Amendment, no matter how common sense it is and stuff like that. It's just bureaucracy, and it belongs in the trash bin, or at least like we should have like more local or state control.
That sounds dystopian. They're actually using just common names of thieves and gun people who are involved in gun crime. So wow, that is wow. That blows my mind. Like I said, I still need to go through and absorb your book. You guys need to get it. You make a lot of good points in this book. I can't believe how many points you got in this short little book. Well, this really ties in with myth number 9, which is that it's easier to buy guns than books. Now, that obviously that's a little bit exaggerated, except it's not. Quoting Obama, he said, "We flood communities with so many guns that it is easier for a teenager to buy a Glock than get his hands on a computer or even a book." So who's we? And where, in fact, are these teenagers that they're buying guns over books or easier than books?
Well, if they're criminals, there's plenty of black market activity to be had where you can get guns pretty easily. But for law-abiding citizens, like I said, you have to go through a NICS background check. I didn't really specifically address the loophole, but even if you go to a gun show, you still have to go and pass a background check. The only stuff that doesn't have background checks are like private transfers from like friends or family. But if you look at the data, most shootings don't even result from that. But at the end of the day, it's a freedom issue. Free individuals that are peacefully cooperating have every right to transfer firearms without the government having to know about it. But to Obama's point, it is just like a snappy talking point that he's using to score cheap points against like pro-gun people. But if you look at the evidence, say for his state in Illinois, for example, they've got waiting periods for firearms purchases. That you have to have like a firearms ID card. You have to go through permits. On top of that, Illinois is a May issue state where the government, ultimately the sheriff or whatever in question, is the one that determines if you can actually carry a firearm concealed. And a lot of these blue states, especially on the coastal areas and very, very densely populated urban centers, they tend to be the most anti-gun, and it's insanely difficult for law-abiding citizens to get guns. The criminals will obviously get them because they have a black market in front of them, and someone that's determined to carry out a crime is going to do so regardless of what laws are on the books. Most laws are basically virtue signaling and are totally useless. And whenever a criminal sees a gun-free zone sign, they're not just going to magically waltz their way out and not commit their dirty act.
Yeah, spot on. And in fact, the next myth is going to talk about that, and that's the one I heard you on the Tom Wood show, because you were on the Tom Wood show just a few days ago, and I'm going to link to that as well. And you made a lot of good points in there. I think you said myth number 8 is the most important to you, if I'm not mistaken. But let me just go over a few stats real quick, because this should really, really wake people up. So just looking at the FBI expanded homicide data table, and I can link to this, the total amount of people that were murdered with weapons of any kind, 15,070. The total amount that was murdered by firearms, 11,004. Now here's the kicker. The amount killed with rifles, 374 out of over 11,000. 374 rifles. That includes your AR-15s. Shotguns, 262. But here's the thing. Think about this. The amount of people killed by knives by murder in 2016 for knives was 1,604. 1,604 were killed by knives. So that's more than rifles and shotguns put together and doubled. Over that even. I mean, it's just when people put that into perspective, like 374. This is what they're talking about when they're saying, we have an AR-15 problem, or they don't even know the difference between semi-automatic and automatic, and they don't even know what a bump stock is. That's why they're trying to ban those. So what do you have to say about that? I mean, when I first heard about that, I couldn't believe it. This is FBI data, though.
Well, it's all about constructing people's perceptions, because the AR-15 has a very menacing cosmetic appearance that makes it look like a kind of like military grade semi-automatic. I mean, full automatic or fire variant like an M4 or an M16, but AR-15s function no differently in terms of fire settings than handguns, and it's just a way of like the media trying to generate confusion because it's an easy win whenever you can confuse people and then associate this gun with like a military weapon that needs to be taken off the streets, and people will buy into that hook, line, and sinker, especially those that don't know much about firearms. Political debates are not really based on logic; they are based on emotion and control of the narrative. That's why you often see that people who are on the right side of an issue, they get trounced. That's what we see with a lot of conservative ink, conventional conservative groups. But in the case of the AR-15, that's where you see the whole assault weapons ban canard being dropped by anti-gun leftists. And there's no such thing as an assault weapon. It's a politically invented term that has actually been expanded to refer to even some handguns. And what all that it is a way to condition people into accepting small degrees of gun bans, which over time will snowball into bigger forms of gun control. And people will say, oh, you're just engaging in a slippery slope fallacy. But if we've learned about politics the past century or so, is that politics operates under a slippery slope law, not a fallacy, because that's just the nature of how the state operates. And when you give these people a foot, they will take the whole mile eventually. That's why it is crucial for pro-gun advocates to not yield even an inch in these debates. We need to control the narrative. We need to arm people with the facts, and we need to stand boldly against these infringements on our rights and reassert that the Second Amendment is a sacred right that belongs to all individuals.
Absolutely. I mean, if you believe in negative rights, meaning you have the right not to have your property stolen from you, you have the right to not have violence used against you, that also implies that you have the right to defend those rights. I want to add one more thing, and then we'll jump into the last 2 minutes and wrap up here. There's one video online because people think bump stocks turn guns into automatic weapons. Not really. Not really. Both in that they're really inaccurate when you're using it. And there's this one video where a guy demonstrates all three. So I think I'm remembering these numbers correctly, but I'm about right. And this is, I'll link to this video. So he shoots a semi-automatic weapon. I think he gets about like 5 or 6 rounds per second. He adds a bump stock. He gets about 7.5 rounds per second. And then he shoots an automatic, gets about like 14 rounds a second. So the bump stock and the semi-automatic is, you're not getting that much more. And you're losing like any accuracy at all. So I want to link to that video just so guys can, everyone can know that. Just good to know because people say these things, and if you don't know that, you'll get stumped. Let's jump right into the last 2 here that we'll discuss for today. And I want everybody to go out and buy this book. I'm just going to keep saying that. It's a few bucks, and you're going to learn a lot from this. You're going to be able to crush the people in these arguments that are bothering you. So myth number 8, gun-free zones prevent mass shootings. And I think you mentioned on the Tom Woods appearance that that was the most important, you think.
Most important because mass shootings are what the media goes off on and always exploits to advance their narrative. Here's the dirty little secret about mass shootings. They occur overwhelmingly in gun-free zones, like 98% of them. It's like almost indisputable. That is like a overwhelming majority of these shootings. And ironically, the first comprehensive gun-free zone law was passed by a Republican president, George H.W. Bush, in 1990, the Gun-Free School Zones Act. And he was like a lifetime NRA member then. And it's pretty ironic that actually happened, but it's been one of the worst gun control policies because it's turned other venues that it covers into for deranged lunatics, and we continue to see this to this day. Even though gun violence has actually declined and like homicide rates have declined, gun-free zones have still facilitated mass shootings for the most part, and it just goes to show that when you have a disarmed populace, they're at the whims of criminals, government, or any other dirty actors that are ready to inflict pain on people that will not be able to fight back.
Yeah, yeah, and we just had that other shooting that recently. It's tough. We have a few minutes here. Let's just discuss this last myth here. Myth number 10: assault weapons bans are an effective form of gun control. I mean, I guess pretty much everything we said have just kind of proved that wrong, but specifically related to assault weapon bans, I mentioned those statistics earlier. Is there anything you can add to that? And maybe we can also add in, I really want to talk about the red flag laws to wrap up as well, because, what are people going to rise up and shoot back? I mean, it's scary to say, but, there's got to be a time where we either fight back or they come and take the guns and they're gone. And then we don't have any means to defend ourselves against this.
Yeah, assault weapons are actually not used that much. And especially like long guns and rifles, they're not used much at all. And really, like, at the end of the day, criminals, even if you banned assault weapons, they will readily turn to handguns and other forms of firearms to carry them out. So they'll find a way. Criminals don't care about laws. And now for red laws, I didn't cover them in the book specifically, but interestingly enough, red flag laws, the first state to implement them, I believe, was Connecticut in the late 90s. And they still had like the Sandy Hook shooting in 2012. And there's not much evidence that has shown that those laws are very effective in reducing crime. And in fact, I think that they do serve as a trampoline, if you will, for more invasive forms of gun control, because essentially a red flag law is like a gun confiscation order where a simple accusation from like an individual, family member, acquaintance, or a friend could have like the cops at your door knocking to take your guns away without even so much as a hearing. And it's actually turned deadly. If you look at the case, so a guy who, an old man of 61 years of age, had cops come to his door around 5 a.m. and they were about to serve him a gun confiscation order. And the guy was clearly shocked. And the resulting struggle, he was eventually shot dead. And that's just like a sign of what is to come if red flag laws become like a national law, which in fact I wrote about in Mises a few months ago, that it's actually a legitimate threat in Congress because it has tremendous bipartisan support, and gun owners should be worried about that, because anything that brings the both parties together, you can absolutely bet the entire House that it's a terrible form of legislation.
Like I said, this is a powerful little book. Let's check to see how many pages it is. I'm just curious how many pages it was, because you packed a lot of info in it. It's a 50-page book. 50-page book costs you a few bucks, and we didn't even cover half of what's covered in there. In fact, some of the myths we didn't cover because we didn't have time is going to be armed citizens can't be trusted with firearms. Mental health legislation could prevent shootings. I think there was one more I did mark it, but Jose, it's been such a pleasure having you on. So I'm going to link to your ebook, which, as you all know, is going to be a few bucks well spent. I'm going to link to your appearance on the Tom Wood Show. That was great. I'll, of course, link to our last episode on Venezuela. That was episode 74, I believe. Also going to link to all your articles in Mises.org. Is there anything else I can link to? Because I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you've appeared on other shows to discuss guns.
Yes, The primary places, though, you can reach me at these days. I can show you them. Hold on a second. On Twitter, it is where I mostly post these. That is at Jose Al Nino. And you can also reach me via email at Jose Nino, Nino, politics@gmail.com. And you can subscribe to my newsletter as well, josealnino.com/newsletter/ you get like a recap of my articles, political takes, and some activism tips. And you can also find me on Facebook as well at Jose Al Nino. And also, I'll pass you a link to my ebook as well. But yeah, those are the primary places that I share my writings and engage with people. And likewise, Stephen, it was a pleasure chatting with you again.
Oh, thank you so much, Jose. I guess the next time we talk, we're going to be talking about your new book coming out in Venezuela. So I'm looking forward to that. Everybody, jump to the links in the show notes page. We'll see you next time.